Star Trek, the original series, is set in the 23rd century, 300 years into the future from the 20th century during which it was being made. The Next Generation, Deep Space Nine, and Voyager would be set a century after that in the 24th century. The 8th Star Trek movie, First Contact, reveals that humans discovered warp drive and met the Vulcans in the mid-21st century. This probably left Trekkies wondering about the time in between First Contact and the original series, the 22nd century. It seems that the writers were also curious, enough to explore that era in its own series. It was already established in The Next Generation that the United Federation of Planets was founded in the year 2161, perhaps the most significant event of the 22nd century, at least for the founding members. The Star Trek series to be set in that century would begin in the year 2151, when human interstellar space exploration was still in its relatively early days and leading up to the Federation's official founding. The series title would come to be Star Trek Enterprise, which may have ruffled some feathers as the first Enterprise no longer referred to the NCC 1701 but the NX-01, requiring specification to differentiate the two. I agree that the specific nomenclature was not strictly necessary. Besides being set in a different century than any other Star Trek series prior, Star Trek Enterprise remains notorious for not having been as well received by audiences as its predecessors. Perhaps most notably, it did not receive 7 seasons like The Next Generation, Deep Space Nine, and Voyager all did, but was instead cancelled after 4 seasons. Additionally, many fans found the ending to be unsatisfying and even insulting. Nonetheless, Enterprise did have its high points, such as providing a lot of exposition and world building. With that said, let's examine everything the series did well and what it could have done better. There will be spoilers if you haven't seen the entire show. When I first started watching Enterprise, I instantly found it to feel a bit more like the original series than the 3 shows that aired immediately before Enterprise, which I suppose is somewhat expected considering the setting and time period. I wouldn't be surprised if Enterprise had brought in viewers who preferred the original series over any of the shows set in the 24th century. Maybe that was even intentional to some degree. The aesthetic and technology of Enterprise are a satisfying combination of modern NASA and Star Trek the original series, featuring wall comms and handheld communicators. The ship's bridge and engineering section bear a particularly striking resemblance to those of TOS. The NX-01 looks like how I legitimately imagine humanity's first interstellar starships could look, though I don't think we'll quite have them ready by next century. We get to see what certain technological advancements from TOS were like in their early stages, namely the Universal Translator and the transporters. The translator takes time to construct a language base, and the transporters are not so widespread, only being used when shuttle transport is considerably more difficult or made impossible. The series features humanity's first encounters with iconic Star Trek species such as Klingons, Andorians, and Tellarites. It also provides a good amount of background and development for each of these species. For example, the Andorians' reputation for being warlike and secretive is put into context, and the Tellarites' tendency to argue is revealed to actually be an important aspect of their culture. We even get an episode detailing why the Klingons of the original series are visually different than those in other Star Trek installments. Vulcan mind melds being depicted as taboo and not widespread felt a bit like a retcon at first, but the 3-part storyline about Surak from season 4 made it fit in with overall canon a little better. The first 2 seasons of Star Trek Enterprise have an episodic Planet of the Week format with a longer background narrative of humanity simply wanting to get out there into exploring space space and prove their capability of doing so to the Vulcans. The third season, however, changes the formula significantly because the real world had experienced a significant change by the time Season 3 was in production, specifically 9/11. Enterprise Season 3 was heavily serialized and had an overarching plot set up by the Season 2 finale, which draws very obvious influence from 9/11, chronicling a terrorist attack on Earth by aliens and the Enterprise's journey into hostile territory in order to seek out those responsible. The serialization and the 9/11 allegory were both likely means to draw in viewers and make sure they tuned in every week. In the years following 9/11, there seemed to be a notable increase in positive depiction of the United States military in American-produced television and movies. Of course, in Star Trek there are no more nation-states, but the MACOs, essentially United Earth's military for operations outside of Starfleet's territory, struck me as a sort of stand-in for the US military. The in-universe reasoning for them coming aboard the Enterprise is that they have more extensive tactical training than Starfleet officers, but it still felt to me like they didn't belong on a Starfleet ship and were shoehorned into the plot. Season 3 did have a few opportunities to step away from that particular narrative for an episode or two at a time, which many newer shows like Star Trek Discovery haven't been as able to do because their seasons aren't given as many episodes. Season 4 was a bit of a return to form with more of a focus on individual stories. Several of these take place over 2 or 3 episode mini arcs, which I found to be just the right size for telling them. Ultimately, making Season 4 out to have a satisfying mixture of both episodic and serialized elements. One two-parter even goes into the Mirror Universe, displaying the moment when that timeline split off from the Prime Universe. Season 4 was also, of course, when the series got cancelled. As is unfortunately the fate of many cancelled series, it happened at a time when the show was just starting to get really good, at least in my opinion. As I mentioned, Enterprise had found its balance in storytelling, and there were clearly more stories to be told. Most notably, the initial conflict between the Federation and the Romulans mentioned in TOS and hinted at in Enterprise Season 4. Some Enterprise spin-off novels are about that conflict, but I really would have liked to see it play out on screen. I'd especially want to know how the Federation fought an entire war against the Romulans, with no one except those who were secretly in league with the Romulans ever seeing what they look like. I imagine that the Mirror Universe storyline would have also picked up again. With the way Season 4 ended, Enterprise didn't exactly go out on a high note. The second to last episode featured the death of the infant binary clone, Elizabeth Teleste Tucker. A baby dying in any case is sad, but Trip and T'Pol experienced the grief acutely because Elizabeth was made from their DNA and they viewed themselves as her parents. I'd have really wanted her to survive, even though it would retcon Spock being the first and only human-Vulcan hybrid. If she had survived, I could even see her appearing in later Star Trek media such as the reboot films, Discovery, and Strange New Worlds. The decision of whether or not the baby would survive was made based on whether the show would be renewed for another season. I think it may have been better to have never introduced her to begin with, or made her a binary clone of 2 species other than human and Vulcan so she wouldn't be a retcon. Apart from the very sad ending, the second to last episode, Terra Prime, would have made a decent series finale. Of course, just about any series finale would have been better than the one Enterprise actually received. There's a lot wrong with the episode These Are the Voyages, so let's just get right into it. First of all, it isn't even a double episode like the previous Star Trek series finales, All Good Things, What You Leave Behind, and Endgame. It features an intriguing plot of the Enterprise crew going on a mission to rescue Shran's daughter, but that should have been an entire episode instead of just part of one. To make matters worse, the story is played out on a holodeck by Commander Riker, giving even less screen time to the characters of the actual series series that the episode is part of. It just makes Riker and Troy feel like intruders into the story. Since Star Trek Nemesis didn't meet expectations, I can see how Paramount didn't want that movie to be the last that was ever seen of TNG, especially since they thought that the movie's divisive reception and Enterprise's cancellation might be the end of the franchise forever. That aspect of These Are the Voyages was a decent homage to TNG, but that series had already received 7 seasons, a proper series finale, and 4 movies. I imagine that TNG fans did like seeing the Enterprise D and hearing Data's voice again, though. That must have come as a pleasant surprise. The ending sequence with the NX-01, NCC-1701, and Enterprise D was nice too, I suppose. Probably the most notorious thing about These Are the Voyages is that it featured the death of Trip Tucker. The specific situation in which he is killed could be called heroic, but it was far from being the only way to resolve the episode's conflict. It was like Kirk's death in Star Trek Generations all over again. Not to mention that Trip's death means his parents have lost 2 children, and that T'Pol has lost her father, mother, infant daughter, and close friend who was also her former lover. Since this storyline is portrayed as occurring on a holodeck, it could be potentially written off as not having actually happened for real. Troy does make a comment about how Trip wouldn't be returning from that mission, but maybe she was just already aware that Riker was playing out a version of that story where Trip would die. Even at the very end, though, we don't even get to see Archer make his speech at the Federation's founding ceremony. So why did Star Trek Enterprise get cancelled exactly? There could be any number of reasons. Maybe fans just didn't want a TOS prequel as opposed to another story set in the 24th century or beyond, like the 3 most previous Star Trek series. It could be that the story was made somewhat less interesting by the fact that only 2 members of the ship's crew were aliens, since the series is set in a time period where not as many first contacts had yet been made. True, Spock was the only featured alien crew member in the original series, but at that point the premise of Star Trek itself was fresh enough to be interesting on its own, and even that series also got cancelled. It could also be the misogynistic writing from Rick Berman, especially considering how progressive Voyager had been with its female characters. The main cast also featured only 2 women and people of color, with Hoshi Sato and Travis Mayweather being underdeveloped and underutilized compared to the characters played by white actors. That might have changed with more seasons of the show, but we'll never know. Sometimes I wonder how different the Star Trek franchise would have been if Enterprise hadn't been cancelled when and how it was. A full 7 seasons would have had the series airing into 2008 or so, which probably would have eliminated the perceived need for an entire franchise reboot, which came in the form of the J.J. Abrams film trilogy, or alternate original series, as it's known to fans. Some of the series pitched in the mid to late 2000s, like Star Trek Final Frontier and Star Trek Federation, might have been greenlit. We still might have gotten later Star Trek shows like Discovery, Lower Decks, and Prodigy, and they would have possibly gone into production sooner and before streaming service original shows were so prominent. I personally don't think Enterprise is one of the best Star Trek series out there, but I still think it deserved better than what it got. It undeniably has its place in the franchise and the in-universe timeline. What do you think of Star Trek Enterprise? Why do you think it got cancelled? And what do you think it could have done better or would have if it had gotten more episodes? Let me know in the comments. Thank you for watching this video. If you're new here, I have multiple other Star Trek videos that you will likely enjoy as well. Live long and prosper, and I'll see you next time.